The trilogies in the Marvel Cinematic Universe are generally disjointed. It's hard enough to keep a steady tone, theme, and message across several years of production when you have the same team, and the Iron Man, Captain America, and Avengers trilogies all have multiple directors and creative teams. When you have disjointed movies, it can become difficult to let a viewing experience be cohesive. Thematic storytelling relies upon consistency, and the Marvel trilogies really don't accomplish that. I'd be hard-pressed to say that any of the Avengers movies have a theme. Sure, there's good versus evil, but that's such a basic trope. I guess you could argue that the villains are all supposedly benevolent tyrants, ultimately holding humanity's best interests in mind, supposedly, while usurping freedom. But even then, it's such a weak excuse. Loki, Ultron, and Thanos are just murdering people because they think they know better. There's no ideological disagreement. They don't represent anything. They're basically just sentient natural disasters that like to justify their war crimes. And as much as Thanos likes to pretend that he's empathic, he's still a sadist, and he represents no real belief system. I want to kill 50% of the entire universe. I don't think your math is correct. Actually, I'm pretty sure it is. He just repeats his thesis over and over again with different words, similarly to Steve in Civil War, and his opponents just say, no, you can't prove it over and over again, already assuming that his premise isn't inherently faulty. Compare Thanos to Sauron, a villain from another popular trilogy. Sauron himself isn't incredibly deep either, but his influence goes beyond punching and torture. Sauron and his reign represent the corrupting presence of power, and the way to defeat him is not just through having more superpowers or vague concepts like freedom is good, but through loving your fellow humans, uniting nations despite cultural differences, and holding yourself to higher standards when you are given power, and even supporting your friends when they struggle with addiction. But could you tell me what the intended message is when countless Wakandans die in the battle to save the white robot? Or why we should care that cars are being blown up in New York? Or the thematic reason why Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver were willing to help Ultron slaughter Africans and Asians, but not Europeans? The Avengers movies are popcorn flicks. They offer no more than a collection of characters that you already recognize doing the things that they do in their own movies, only now they're next to each other. The Captain America movies at least have themes, but they're disjointed, even internally. Like, Steve says that even though 40s America did things that they regretted, it was always in pursuit of freedom, ignoring that Fury was probably referring to the imprisonment of Americans based off from Japanese ancestry, a direct violation of freedom. But the Russo brothers consistently show a double standard for freedom. White people kill dozens of black people, it's an infringement upon freedom if they face consequences. A black man tries to arrest the white man that is suspected to have murdered his father, it's freedom to try to stop him. The Russo movies are distinctly about freedom, at least for white people, but that's never really a concern in the first movie. Winter Soldier sees Arnim Zola state that Hydra was founded on the belief that humanity could not be trusted with its own freedom, ignoring the desire of Gentile, non-Roma, able-bodied filmmakers to rewrite Nazis as general tyrants and not people motivated by white supremacy and ableism, and the bizarre desire to cast Jewish people and people of color as neo-Nazis. This isn't really even consistent with the first movie, which is, save all of the theatrics, a rather standard war film. The Iron Man films at least have internally consistent themes, but they're still at odds with each other. Iron Man is anti-war, but it's the kind of way that the US military can pay for it. The Iron Man 2 movie is actually closer to pro-war, and while Iron Man 3 is anti-war and so vehemently anti-war, even the military wasn't going to support it, it directly contradicts Iron Man 1, which suggests that the best way to end violence is with more violence. Iron Man 3 says it's through de-weaponizing and focusing resources on healthcare and science. 1 and 3 might make a good arc if 2 didn't take things backwards. It's weird then that the Thor Trilogy not only maintains a single message, but it grows it naturally, and it even does so in films with 3 different directors, 3 different qualities, and 3 different types of comedy. The recurring theme across all Thor movies is one of anti-imperialism. The first Thor is a pretty good movie, directed by talented Kenneth Branagh. Thor is, on the surface, character-driven, but there's a reason that Loki is the only good Phase 1 Marvel villain. It's largely because his pathos draws from the real world, at least in Thor. Asgardians live in a post-imperialist society, unconcerned with the past deeds of their nations. In many ways, this reflects the attitude of many English, Spanish, French, German, and United States American people. The past is over. We're not actively invaded countries now, so you can't hold us accountable. Like the UK and the US and so on, Asgard not only profits from an imperialist past, they maintain a form of unsteady peace with other locations, largely held by their unbelievable arsenal that holds the ability to annihilate any inhabited land without sending troops onto the ground. This position of power and privilege plays directly into the story of Thor. While it's constructed around Thor as a person struggling with empathy and putting other people first, the film offers a stark yet subtle condemnation of imperialism. The actions that caused Thor and his friends to first attack Jotunheim were actually manufactured by a bored aristocrat interested in increasing his power. These actions are also minor compared to what Thor does, as he murders several dozen frost giants before Odin shows up. Odin himself represents the modern, mild, liberal philosophy of, I can't be held responsible for what my ancestors did. Only, as he himself is thousands of years old, he gets to play both sides. His entitlement and privilege are put most on display in the movie's twist. Well, it's a twist if you aren't familiar with either Norse mythology or the Marvel comics it's based upon. It is revealed that Loki, Odin's son and Thor's brother, is actually a frost giant, taken from one of Odin's victorious battlefields. The forceful removal of children from one group to another is, according to the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, published by the UN, campaigned for by Raphael Lemkin, who defined the term genocide. Odin committing this act is both portrayed as evil and as not a big deal to the heroic characters. Odin says Loki would have died had he not taken him, claiming he was abandoned, but there's no way he could have possibly known that. All he really knows is that he killed a bunch of frost giants, and then he found a baby left alone. The most interesting part of Loki comes when, even after he learns he is biologically a frost giant, his assimilation and indoctrination in the Asgardian way of life is so thorough that he attempts to finish the genocide that his father started. Loki says that frost giants are the creatures parents tell stories about to frighten their children, and learning that he's one of them, and that he has emotions, love for his family, and the capacity for kindness should cause him to view the frost giants as equally deserving of respect. However, he is filled with so much self-hatred that he would rather try to kill all of the frost giants, and when his plan fails, and Odin remains stalwart in maintaining his Cold War, he attempts his own suicide. He was never truly accepted as Asgardian because of his race, and he was never able to accept himself as a frost giant because he was told from his childhood that being one was an abomination. I think it's worth pointing out how real-life race and ethnicity factor into this parallel. Being directed by Kenneth Branagh, the race of the characters in the source material matter less than the talent of the actors. For example, we got Denzel and Keanu as two white Italian brothers in Much Ado About Nothing. Now, this being part of a franchise, he probably had less freedom than usual, and he had to work alongside Sarah Finn and Randy Hiller, regulars for the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So I bet Thor and Loki were required to be white. Still, we did get Idris Elba as Heimdall, and Maximiliano Hernandez as Jasper Sitwell, both of whom are white in the comics. I think this change for Heimdall works, not just because Elba is a fantastic actor, but because it makes the film more clear in its message. The third most powerful individual in Asgard is a black man, and it's never commented upon because race as humans conceive it doesn't really seem to be a factor in Asgard's power structure at first. But despite Heimdall's power, and the fact that he's Thor's best friend, he's still relegated to the outskirts of society where he can be useful. More on him and the subject of race later. Avengers is a fun movie, but it sucks in furthering Loki's character, or Thor's, or Asgard's story. The Dark World is without a doubt the worst Thor movie. It's horribly paced, the only one of the three that's visually uninteresting, preoccupied with cheap grabs of humor, and it kicks off the whole Infinity Stones plotline that would derail almost every sequel going forward. The script isn't as human as the first movie, or as funny as the third, and the direction that they took was clearly influenced by what the internet liked about Loki and the Avengers, and it's widely regarded as one of the worst MCU movies. Probably rightfully so. But there are some things that work. Loki is uninterested in furthering the goals of Asgard anymore, and he's only kept alive because his mother loves him. Though her love is genuine, she was still complicit in her husband's kidnapping and deception of the child. Yet, even as he is disillusioned with the imperialist dreams of old Asgard, he still loves his mother, and their relationship, though built on lies, is still real, and they care for each other despite the years of lying and recent attempts of genocide. The other thing that really works, if you know his backstory, is Malekith. I know, he's one of the bad Marvel villains, maybe the worst. But that's in part because they cut out his motivation. Those scenes were filmed. They didn't make it into the movie. Had they, though, I think Malekith would have been one of the better MCU villains, and it would mean that all 3 Thor movies would have had great ones. In his deleted backstory, Malekith's family was heavily implied to be murdered by Bor, Odin's father, which raises the question as to whether Malekith's attack against the Asgardians was an invasion or a revolution. After all, Odin is described as the protector of the 9 realms, but he was never asked for that protection, and Bor's protection looks a lot more like a war. He would also have been shown to have missed the life he lived with his family, implying that life in darkness is not impossible or even unpleasant. Instead, he just has a different culture. This change would give a one-note villain actual motivation, and knowing these scenes were filmed, you can actually see a somber resolve in Eccleston's performance, especially when he communicates with Ekanoye Agbaje's Algrim, as you can sense that they see each other as family and dear friends, something that's missing in any other 2 Marvel villains that work together. There's loss in his voice, and his behavior feels more like revenge rather than rampant conquest. He's still evil, but he's a victim of Asgard's imperialism first. I'm not saying that Malekith is secretly a great character, but I do think that Eccleston, who himself comes from working-class backgrounds and is vocally critical of England's monarchy as well as its sexism and racism, gives a fantastic performance, even if he's underused. And these deleted scenes also support the anti-imperialist themes that are actually already present in this movie. Even if we assume that Odin is correct in his order of events, he still tells Thor that he will sacrifice his men's lives in pursuit of victory over a foreign power. Thor is shown to be wiser for choosing to prevent war. Algrim releases all of the prisoners save Loki, who is clearly of an upper class. Malekith only accepts Loki upon hearing that he is from Jotunheim, a similarly subjugated realm. And what I think is actually the most symbolic, interesting scene in the whole movie, upon breaking through Asgard's defenses, rather than deciding to torture someone or make a bad joke like any other Marvel villain would, Malekith destroys the throne, silently. It's the throne that the Dark Elves hate. Not the people, not the realm, but the throne. Still, despite all that, Thor the Dark World is not a good movie, and it is not concerned enough in conveying these themes. But of course there was a third movie. Thor Ragnarok is both the greatest Thor movie and the most adamantly anti-imperialist. While Odin had always held a facade of liberalism, the first 2 movies heavily hint at Asgard's past of conquest. And then Ragnarok rips that band-aid off in the first arc of the film. Hela doesn't just represent imperialism. She was Odin's right hand, and even more, she reflects neo-nationalist movements, desiring to respark the fires of colonialism. She even draws her power from Asgard. The most powerful sign of her meaning, though, comes when she reveals the entire fresco of the Asgardian palace to Scourge, showing him and the audience what lies beneath the face of the good guy of the universe, Odin, a history of murder and slaughter. Later, as she says to Thor, "Where do you think all this gold came from?" The wealth of Asgard, as well as the wealth of nations, such as the UK and the US, were not achieved through virtue or creativity alone, but also by death and destruction of unsuspecting or disadvantaged peoples. I would be remiss if I didn't talk about how director Taika Waititi's personal politics play into this film, but as I'm not from New Zealand, I think I'd benefit from referencing 2 analyses by Daniel Taipua and Neil Curtis. I will link both of their works below. Many people see anti-imperialism as synonymous with hating your culture or your history, but for Waititi, even though the film is opposed to imperialism, he clearly shows that it's healthy to take pride in your roots, and no clearer is this scene than in Brunnhilde the Valkyrie. Brunnhilde, when we meet her, is disenfranchised to say the least. She has lost her home, her lover, her status, and everything she's ever known. She's driven from Asgard and comes to Sakaar, specifically so that she can drink and forget. But as she says to Thor, she can't turn away anymore. And if she has to die, it might as well be while killing Hela. Despite spending years selling her skills to the Grandmaster, she chooses to return to Asgard to help her people, and once again dons the armor of her past. Taipua and Curtis both see similarities between Valkyrie and indigenous people, specifically with Maori, the native inhabitants of New Zealand. Taika Waititi, himself Maori, gave Valkyrie's ship the colors of the Tino Rangatiratanga flag, the flag of the Maori people, and when she returns to Asgard, it's the return of an indigenous Asgardian. I suppose now would be a good time to return to the subject of race in this trilogy. As I said, while Asgard seems post-racial, it's worth noting that of the 4 friends of Thor that helped him commit treason, only Heimdall is punished. Now yes, this is probably because he is the one with the ability to reveal Loki's trickery, but the symbolism stands of the sins of the white citizens, which included assaulting guards, being forgiven, while the sins of Heimdall, merely distracting Odin, are punished. Still, despite his unfair treatment by the government, Heimdall uses his power and abilities, as well as his privileges, to protect the weak and vulnerable. He would have every right to be bitter and seek only to support himself, but he values the community, not for its ability to expand, but because it can unite, despite all of the differences its members may have, in the face of adversity. I don't think it's a coincidence either that the Berserker army are a uniform national force, and the Asgardian army is diverse, specialized, united, but distinct. But as great as Valkyrie and Heimdall are, Ragnarok is a Thor movie, and unlike Captain America Civil War, it feels like our titular character is front and center. Thor gets everything that Steve doesn't. A conversation with his best friend, a great new romantic interest that doesn't feel forced, a heartfelt reunion with his old friend turned enemy turned friend again, and an appearance by an Avenger that actually adds to the story rather than detract. But even more than that, while Steve begins and ends his 3rd movie as much the same man, Thor changes. Like the first Avengers, Age of Ultron did little to advance the plot of Thor's character, instead roping him into the Cosmic Infinity Stone questline. And Ragnarok addresses this with a single line. Instead, Thor is concerned with protecting Asgard once more. He defeats Surtur, prophesied to be the end of Asgard, and he seeks out Odin, a man that, from his perspective, is needed for Asgard's success. However, he is dying, but Asgard is not. See, everything that Thor and many white audiences associate with Norse/Asgardian culture are taken from him by the end of the movie. He no longer has his historical artifact, or his homeland, or his ability to wage wars in foreign lands. He even loses both his blonde hair and blue eyes. But Asgard lives on. As Thor discovers, it's not the items or the land or even the physical characteristics that make up Asgardians. It's the people. The people together, no matter what they look like, united by a cultural identity, will always be Asgard. And thus, over the arc of 3 movies, both Thor and Asgard have transformed from an imperialist entity to a nomadic presence. The souls are still alive, but they don't need to subsist off from the blood of others to do so. At least until the Russo brothers ruined everything. I've seen people call the Thor Trilogy confused, and while a singular tone is never found, I'd argue that, more than any other 3 Marvel films, they successfully tell a single story. Thor goes from a warmonger to a calculating warrior, then to a rogue agent, to finally, a leader. And Asgard changes alongside him. Sure, not all 3 movies are great, but the story itself is one for the ages.